morning, everyone. I am Marion Ryan, the district. I have the pleasure of being the district attorney of Middlesex County, and I want to welcome you all to our second data summit. We're very grateful to have you here with us today. We have an amazing array of individuals with us to talk about some of the work they've been doing in this area. And I will just say at the beginning, I'm going to do a short introduction of our panelists, but to maximize our time together, we'll put their full bios in the chat so you'll be able to see that. As I'm sure all of you know, we are convening today because of the increasing importance of harnessing and unlocking the power of data in the context of criminal justice. We have all seen in recent years the way that data-driven decision-making is so critical to both doing two things, both informing our decisions in future cases, but also in ensuring that the public has access to the outcome in cases we've already resolved. And increasing access to data in combination with public-private partnerships can help us to reach a wider spectrum of the public with that data, hoping to show that problems can be more easily identified and solved, and also to increase the public understanding of the work we do. We do so much work that people don't see and don't always understand what's happening with that. And we also want to reaffirm our commitment to transparency and accountability. It's no longer a question of whether the public should be allowed to look at your data. They deserve to be able to do that. They expect to be able to do that. And phrases like data-driven outcome and data storytelling are not just buzzwords. They're really central to the work of almost every public and private organization. Almost all major colleges and universities across this country are teaching courses on how to develop the skills to collect and better communicate with data. And it makes sense that we would be using metrics, facts, and other insights to make informed decisions. But it doesn't help anyone if we're just taking numbers and we can't communicate what we are seeing, both internally and externally. Not only, as I mentioned, does it help with public accountability, but it helps with our staff and our colleagues, especially the folks that we're relying on to collect and input this data, and then to effectuate change based on what we see. And for me, that's why the conversations like the ones we're going to have today are so important. In Middlesex County, we are incredibly fortunate to have valuable and long-standing relationships with the communities, including our law enforcement partners, the defense bar, our school communities, whether it ranges from kids going off to kindergarten to our 21 colleges and universities, and then our community partner groups. And we've really worked to identify issues, to respond with training, workshops, community meetings, getting to practical and meaningful resolutions. And this summit is another step in that process. And then we're also thinking about the fact, and to me, this is really important. We're collecting data. We're looking at lots of criminal cases, lots of outcomes. But that understanding and that approach to the data has to always be tempered by an awareness that every criminal case involves unique human beings, unique victims, unique defendants, unique witnesses, and every case has to be given adequate attention and be resolved in light of its individual circumstances. And again, that is what we owe to everybody we are serving. But if we're never looking at our work on that more macro level, we're not potentially going upstream in someone's life and providing critical services that could alter the course of their future. That's why we've selected today panelists and speakers who are wonderfully attuned to this tension and who are each so valuable in these criminal justice conversations, both locally and nationally. We've made strides here in ensuring that data analysis really informs our decisions. It helps us to know if our policies and practices are effective, if diversion and other non-punitive approaches are being maximized, and are they being applied equitably, and are they working? And are we, through other kinds of very measurable benchmarks, whether it's restitution or other materials, really getting to justice for victims? We've made significant efforts to publish the raw data from decades of past work in this office for the public's review. Currently, anyone can go on our website and see 60 different data points from our case tracking system. We consistently post our data from several decision points, including cases that resolve at arraignment, statistics on cases where we request personal recognizance rather than cash bail, and those where we ask that a person be held because of dangerousness without bail. And beginning in the spring of 2018, we began collecting very detailed information about race and ethnicity of defendants in our county. That first involved us determining what information would be useful to gather in those fields and how to best categorize it. Ultimately, we decided to gather our race and ethnicity data in a manner consistent with the manner used by the United States Census Bureau. We then devoted substantial resources just in terms of work power and commitment to upgrading our systems to ensure that the data was being consistently and accurately collected and then recorded. And that was to really be certain that we were administering justice across our 54 cities and towns in an equal way, regardless of race, gender, or ethnicity. We've enhanced our ability to analyze and report on the disposition of our cases and to detect any disparate results that might be the result of race, gender, or ethnicity. We hired a data analyst to work with our information technology department, really dedicated to an understanding of our current tracking system and how to create reports that will keep us looking at our work. And those additional resources have helped us to work with other stakeholders, including the ACLU, Citizens for Juvenile Justice, the Committee for Public Counsel, who all use our data and our reports to enhance their work and look at whether their clients are getting the critical services they need. We've also painfully learned through that process that verifying and error checking our data is essential to give us confidence in the conclusions we're reaching. Collecting clean data is critical. Collecting data and not ever getting to conclusions has no value. In 2018, and I say this by way of example, we ended the practice of asking the court for cash bail when we had nonviolent, low-level cases in the district court. There were, of course, upon that announcement, lots of questions and some skepticism about what the impact would be. And we wondered whether we would see an increase in people not coming to court if they hadn't posted cash bail. And we also wanted to be sure that as much as possible, that policy was being administered equally across the 1.8 million people that we serve. And to answer those questions, we entered into a public-private partnership with the Institute on Race and Justice at Northeastern University. They helped us to analyze and to understand our data. We gave them unfettered access to our raw data for review and analysis, and they produced a report, which is available on our website, that examined the outcome of the new policy and really helped us to advance the public understanding of that approach to bail. It also left the door open for improvement. We learned that we needed to be doing more. In law enforcement, we're still working to identify what some of the barriers are. For instance, antiquated software that we have, silos that exist across the many agencies we interact with to get more complete pictures. And as technology evolves, we are using more tools to visualize both our data and statistics and present them in a way that they are easy to consume. I really believe that people who aren't experts in your field have to be able to understand and interpret what it is that you're giving them in an accurate way. We recognize that our work in this area requires us to be deliberate and reflective. We need to understand how we can do more. And to that end, we brought together today, as I mentioned, an amazing group of experts to help us understand how to better gather, analyze the data, and then more effectively use it. We're going to hear first from Kevin Scott, Dr. Kevin Scott, who is the Deputy Director at the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the United States Department of Justice. He's going to talk to us about modernizing the BJS regarding data usage, the visualization, and the data communication, and ensuring that their data is what we're all looking for: timely, accurate, relevant, and easily accessible. Kevin brings a wealth of knowledge to this field. He's been doing this for a very long time, previously worked in the court statistics unit, has served as a policy and research analyst. And as I said, all of his information is in the chat. But I'm really, really happy to have Kevin with us today to kick off this conversation. And Kevin, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. And those opening remarks are exactly the kind of remarks that we like to hear about the commitment to both collecting and sharing data, because those are values that the Bureau of Justice Statistics shares and is hoping to take to a national scale, and understand that looking within one's jurisdiction is helpful, but inevitably and invariably trying to build a national picture and trying to understand what's happening across the country is part of that. But to do that, of course, we have to work with local governments and local data providers who are willing to share their data and who are committed to the importance of collecting data. And I love it when I hear people talk about clean data. I'm maybe the only person who gets excited to hear that phrase, but I was delighted to hear that, and that's exactly what works best. It helps improve decision making, but I also appreciate that sometimes these are data points, and we need to remember the people who are in a situation or in a system that may appear at one level to be data points, but have unique cases. And the data can't do everything. There are obviously limitations to the data, so understanding the individuals in the system is equally, if not more, important. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Bureau of Justice Statistics for people who may not be familiar with our agency, and then talk a little bit about what we're doing at the national level, and a little bit about how we benefit and how we hope to collaborate with our local data providers across the country and across the stages of the criminal justice system. If I can share. See if I can share the right screen. All right. Just confirming. That's not the right screen, is it?
That looked right.
All right. How's that look?
Yep. That seems to be your opening page, Bureau of Justice Statistics.
Yes.
Okay. Yep,
Okay.
you're good.
Terrific. All right. So briefly, the Bureau of Justice Statistics is the primary statistical agency of the Department of Justice. We are one of 13 principal federal statistical agencies spread throughout the federal government. As a principal federal statistical agency, we have both kind of independence and obligations to credibly and accurately and timely report data. And that data is to be used and is to be disseminated as widely as possible. We're not as big as the Bureau of the Census. We don't make as much news probably as the Bureau of the Census or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but we share with them the same principles and guidelines that underlie all of our work, and we work together to build the federal statistical community. The mission of BJS is to collect, analyze, publish, and disseminate information on crime, criminal offenders, victims of crime, and the operation of justice systems at all levels of government. So at the municipal level, at the county level, the state level, and the national level, we collect, report, and analyze and disseminate those data, and we do that to a broad array of audiences. Our priorities as an agency are to modernize first. We're working to develop systems, acknowledging that we need to get data to as many people in as many ways, and to do that, we need to undertake kind of an understanding of the entire data processing pipeline and figure out what it is to do to kind of work in a modern data environment. We also, as an agency, have been trying to work to engage. We have relationships. We have kind of customary relationships with what we call our data providers. But that term, I think, even implies kind of a one-way street where people are giving us data, and we're trying not to think of things in those terms. We're trying to think in terms of in exchange for sharing data with us, there are services and resources that we can provide. And of course, we need data from our data providers in order to kind of help build that national picture. And so we're trying to provide kind of that collective good But doing that requires kind of engaging not just the kind of those people who have the data, but those people who can be advocates for collecting and sharing data. We've been working at BJS to work to support our staff. I can say that, like many people, we worked very well during the pandemic, but we're excited to be kind of back on the road the past year and a half or so, engaging with our stakeholders and trying to find new audiences, and to try to build those relationships both internally and externally, so that our staff have the opportunity to build those relationships. And finally, and maybe kind of relevant to why I'm here today, is that we're here to collaborate. We want to help others understand kind of the challenges that we face, but we also want to understand the challenges that they face, so that we can help build a bigger picture, a more comprehensive picture of the criminal justice system in the United States than we have traditionally been able to do. In that kind of spirit, I would say that thinking through how BJS has kind of approached things traditionally, we've thought of ourselves as having kind of two key sets of stakeholders. The first is the general public, and that includes policymakers. And that audience has been kind of the target of what we call the BJS report. We still produce those reports. We still try to provide context to the data. But the intent of those is to kind of pre-bake all the analyses, and to, there are limitations on how many ways you can slice the data in a particular publication. And so while we provide what we think are kind of the key indicators from a particular data collection, we have to make some choices about what we can and can't share, because we can't just we can't put all the data into all the possible tables that we want. So our second engagement has kind of been traditionally with what I would call researchers, and most of these are academic researchers, but certainly there's a set of kind of real core researchers at advocacy organizations that are real data savvy people, as well, kind of sprinkled across municipal and state governments. There are people really committed to understanding not just their data, but trying to find other data for benchmarking comparisons. For those people, what we've traditionally done, and what we will continue to do, is we archive our data to the extent that it's possible under the agreements that we make with our data providers, which includes respondents to household surveys, includes law enforcement agencies, prosecutors' offices, courts, departments of correction, individuals who are incarcerated, across a variety of sources. We want to show our work. We want to make the data available so that people who don't find the analysis that they want in one of our reports can do that analysis. But to do that, typically you need a skill set in reading in data and analyzing the data and understanding how to properly apply weights in a survey, or have that kind of advanced, maybe not advanced, but at least a moderate amount of statistical training to kind of work with data sets. I think of those two kind of audiences as two ends of a spectrum: the kind of people who want everything prepackaged for them, and the people who want nothing prepackaged for them. But I think that what we're increasingly trying to realize is that there is a large set of people with a good set of data skills who don't want to take a data set and download it into their favorite statistical package. And it's always an indicator that you have a favorite statistical package is always not a bad sign, but is a sign of kind of your life goals. But not everybody either has the time to do that, or has the skill set to do that, or wants to do that, and would like something beyond what's available in a report, but doesn't want to have to go figure out how to open and download a data set and figure out the entire code book in order to look at the data. And so, as my predecessor in this position said, that we increasingly recognize that different people need different data in different ways for different uses. And we're trying to meet those needs, and to be agnostic about how people want to get to our data. And one of the ways that we're doing that is that we're trying to focus on data tools that would support ad hoc analyses, so that we do some of the kind of organizing of the data to allow for individual or specific queries, but we reduce the costs of actually conducting those queries, and try to put the data in a data-friendly user tool that still has some limitations, but takes care of some of the most difficult parts of the initial reading in and analysis of a data set, and make sure kind of that when you get to an analysis out of a data tool, that the weights have been applied correctly, or that the missing data has been properly accounted for, or that if there are things like significance tests that need to be done because we're working with sample surveys, that we provided you with the information that you need in order to conduct those significance tests, and you don't have to calculate the standard error out of the data set. If we're going to do something off of a sample-based data set, we're going to provide you with the standard errors and allow you to do your own calculations to determine at what levels of statistical significance you're seeing relationships that might be of interest. All of that said, of course, we're still continuing to write our reports. We're still committed, as part of the principles of federal statistical agencies, to sharing our data as publicly and as widely as possible. But we understand that there's kind of a large group of people and a growing group of people in the middle of the spectrum who have questions kind of beyond the initial analyses and want to be able to dive into the data a little bit more. And we want to be able to facilitate those groups of people. And I suspect that if you're on this call today, you're probably in that group of people. All right. So to kind of frame where I'm going, this is what we call, and I think is commonly called the criminal justice funnel, but we've managed to annotate this one with the data collections that BJS undertakes. Some are annual. The ones in green are annual if you're squinting at your screen really closely. Those that are in black are occasional. They're periodic data collections. But we try to collect data across the criminal justice spectrum, from the commission of a crime all the way through arrest, adjudication, incarceration, or other sentencing. And then we are also looking at recidivism and the ability of people to successfully re-enter into society. So we have, I think, something like 64 data collections, depending on how you count them, many of which, about 30 of which, we conduct on an annual basis. To take those data into some of our data tools, I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of those look like. And I'll be honest, at this point, there's always the temptation when you're doing a presentation to try to do live demos of data tools. And I have steered clear of that temptation. And I have decided instead to provide screenshots, which are boring, but also to give URLs, but also to the specific tools. But if you go to the BJS homepage, which is bjs.ojp.gov, and click on data at the top, there's a link right there that says data tools that will get you to all of the tools that I'm about to kind of highlight in the next couple of minutes. All right. So the first, and probably one of my favorite and one of our most important data tools, is the NCVS dashboard, which we call the NDash. Is a data tool designed to allow people to dig into our signature data collection, which is the National Crime Victimization Survey. At this point, I want to say two things about the NCVS. The first is to stay tuned for results in the near future from the 2022 survey of National Crime Victimization Survey. And when we do release those results, we'll push the data that we used in that into the NDash tool, so that as soon as you see news stories about criminal victimization, you know that you can come to this tool and you can do your digging on specific kinds of criminal victimization, both the demographics of crime victims and the nature of offenses. And you can do year-to-year comparisons. You can compare over multiple years to kind of look at trends to see how 2022 differs from previous years. And poke around. And in this tool, what we've done is we have a quick graphics, which are some of the things that we think people are most likely to want, but there's a custom graphics tab that allows you to kind of do your own detailed analyses of particular crime types and offenses. The one thing I will say about the NCVS is that what we won't do in the data tools is we don't provide kind of narrow state level data, simply because the NCVS sample size is not big enough in any one state in any 1 year to provide us data. We are conducting state level estimation, but we're doing so at 3-year intervals. So we have enough sample to get an idea of what criminal victimization looks like in some of the most populous states, but we're doing so on kind of 3-year intervals. And we continue to publish that into reports, which means I think we'll eventually move some of those data and into tools so that people can at least look at the state level analysis. The other thing I want to say about the NCVS briefly is that the NCVS is turning 50 this year, and it looks great for its age. And we are having a party for the NCVS in a couple of weeks. And if you go to our homepage, which again is bjs.ojp.gov, you're welcome to join our celebration virtually. We'll have a celebration at the main Justice Building in the morning, and then we're going to have a couple of panels to talk about what can and can't be learned from the NCVS and what it has done over the past 50 years in the afternoon. And both of those sessions can be attended virtually. So I encourage you to attend those sessions on the 27th of September. All right. One of the other kind of primary data sources for kind of measurement and crime in the United States is actually the FBI's data collection, the Uniform Crime Reports. And as has been much remarked in the press over the past couple of years, what the FBI has done, what they started to do with 2021 data, is they transitioned from summary reporting data to NIBRS data, which is incident-based reporting data. And incident-based reporting data is wonderful. It's incredibly rich, and it tells us a lot about the nature of the offenses, the nature of the victims, and the nature of the people who are arrested for crimes reported to law enforcement. It is a much more robust and a much more promising tool for policymakers and for people who are concerned, to answer the questions, what do we know about crime in our community? The NIBRS data provides a much more robust picture of that data than the summary data ever did. The challenge, of course, is that the coverage of NIBRS is not complete. It's not under summary. Something like 98% of law enforcement agencies provided counts of offenses to the FBI under the summary system. And as of 2022, about 2/3 of law enforcement agencies provided incident level data, the much more detailed, much more rich data to agencies. So the coverage is not as complete, but I think that's for those communities where the coverage is very strong, which would include Massachusetts, the promise of NIBRS data is significant, is much stronger. The other kind of challenge about NIBRS data is, like any large data set or database, it's hard to work through. So you would have to ingest all of the data. You would have to understand the fields, take a look at the data quality in order to make any kind of reasonable conclusions about what you're seeing in the data. And so we decided that's not a realistic expectation of people. And so we built this tool, which is the Law Enforcement Agency Reported Crime Analysis Tool, and we like to call it LEARCAT. The LEARCAT tool, which takes the NIBRS data that is provided to the FBI by law enforcement agencies and state UCR programs and allows users to drill down into those data to get much more detailed analyses. And so it's still the NIBRS data, still the data that's provided to the FBI, but it's presented in a user-friendly tool that allows you to answer kind of key questions about the commission of the crime, the victims of those crimes, and the relationship between the person who reported the offense and the person who, if a person was arrested or persons were arrested for that offense, their relationship. So it provides a much more granular, much stronger, and a much more robust tool. So this is, I think the power of the NIBRS data gets a little bit lost in the difficulties of analysis, and the intent of the LEARCAT tool was to make the NIBRS data that states are providing to the FBI much easier for people to analyze on their local jurisdictions, at the state level, to understand and to provide context to the data, and so that they understand what they're seeing rather than trying to have to do kind of data analysis from scratch, which is promising, but is challenging. And so the intent of the LEARCAT tool is to make those data much easier to analyze and to understand and to put into context. Here with the FBI data, the FBI estimates of crime reported to law enforcement for 2022, not yet released. This tool has data on incidents through 2021. When the FBI updates with their data, we will push an update out to this tool. So all these tools we're trying to update on annual releases of the data to provide the most current data in the tool and not requiring people to download another data set and try to figure out all the problems with the data set and solve all the problems. They should be able to just go to this tool and do the analysis and get the results that they were hoping to find. All right. One other, I think, data set that I want to spend just a little bit of time on is what we call the Justice Expenditure and Employment Tool. And I think, one of the questions that it kind of sits at the core of the criminal justice system that is sometimes overlooked because the data are sometimes difficult to find is how much are we spending? and how are we allocating our funds across corrections, across law enforcement, across judicial systems, and how does that differ from state to state, from county to county, and from city to city? So we decided to help, again, allow people to explore this question by building a data tool. Rather than asking people to figure out how to download a data set or connect to an API, we built a tool that this one we affectionately call JEET, that allows people to kind of dig into those data at a very granular level, to understand how the municipal, county, and state governments that they reside in, that they pay taxes to, are spending their money, and to compare how that's done across states, across large counties, and across large cities. One of the things I just want to say about this tool is that what's really nice is that we're building off of a couple of data collections conducted by the Census Bureau on how governments spend their money and how governments hire people. And they've been doing that for a long enough time that we expect within the next several months to put data back to 1982 into this tool, which will give us nice long running series and allow people to answer questions. How much are we spending on law enforcement? How much are we spending on corrections? How does it vary across different parts of the country? And those questions are, I think, very much front and center to the debate over the criminal justice system, the size and the footprint of the criminal justice system. And we're trying to bring the data to bear to allow people to answer those questions. One last data tool that I want to briefly point to before I talk a little bit more generally is what we call, we have a data tool of the survey of prison inmates, which is an occasional survey that we do of people who are incarcerated in state and federal prison. And the data that we can get from a survey that we can't get from administrative records, we usually get their demographics from administrative records, but we don't necessarily get things like their educational background or their employment history before incarceration. We might be able to get their criminal history records from administrative systems, but we're not necessarily going to get all of the detail about whether they had a firearm in the crime that was involved in the crime that led them to incarceration. And we certainly, from administrative data, won't get questions about their physical and mental health, as well as their substance use disorder, their substance use, both kind of alcohol and drugs. And so we conduct a survey occasionally when we have the resources of prisoners to ask them these questions. And the last time we were able to do this was 2016. We're gearing up to do it again. But again, in part, I think because the data here, it's difficult to share these data widely because it does kind of raise privacy concerns and re-identification concerns. We built a data tool that will allow people to kind of dig into the data to answer questions about what the incarcerated population looked like, at least in 2016. And of course, that sets a baseline for continuing studies. But the idea here, again, is to not require people to go through IRBs and to download the data sets, but to allow them to use the data tool to hopefully answer most of the questions that are in front of them. We are, I'll just say briefly that we still have some data tools on cold fusion, which I think is probably not entirely uncommon in the federal government, but we are moving our data tools off of cold fusion by the end of 2023. Our correction statistical analysis tool has already been moved. I'm leaving a link there for you. But again, there's a data tools page on our homepage. And there are updates coming to several of our tools, including a prison recidivism analysis tool. We have data on parole and probation that we're putting into an updated tool. And we have data on the federal criminal justice system that is frequently cited, perhaps more in Washington, D.C. than in other parts of the country, but is of interest for people who are looking at federal crimes. And our data from the federal criminal justice system are particularly strong. And as a result, that tool is particularly useful if that's your area of interest. The other thing that I kind of alluded to briefly is that, not only are we trying to make these tools available, but we're trying to move forward in a way to disseminate our data in kind of modern ways. And one way that my predecessor as the director of BJS kind of thought through was just answer quick questions. And to answer one question that kind of everybody's asking, like how much carjacking is there in the United States? What are the kind of rates of violent victimization by the different racial and ethnic categories that are kind of common to the federal government, and to put those data in a discrete place and answer a discrete question to try to unpack and make it easy for people to answer that one discrete question. And so we call that series Just the Stats. We publish about one of these a month. We published on the topics on the left, in addition to several other topics. And we're trying to make these publications online first, web first. And we'll be continuing to produce these, and we'll continue to produce them in a web first way. One of the kind of counterintuitive findings that we wanted to ask ourselves, and there's certainly been a robust debate, particularly over the past 2 or 3 years, about kind of what victimization looks like by race. And normally, the National Crime Victimization Survey can answer that question for groups for which there is large sample sizes, but that typically means white persons, Black persons, and those people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. But that for people who are Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and for people who don't consider themselves one of the first 3 groups, we can't typically provide those data. And so we took a look at our data. We combined a couple of years of the National Crime Victimization Survey, and what we found, and what you can see kind of in the picture on the right, is that the victimization rate, the violent victimization rate for people who identify as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander is in fact lower than the victimization rate for people who are white, Black, or Hispanic, as well as the overall rate, which is the black line in this. And you can see that line at the top, the gray line, which is other, which is primarily people who are American Indian or Alaska Native, or people who are of 2 or more races. And that group is actually the group that kind of stands out in the cluster of lines. And so we thought that was useful. We thought that was something that we could share with the broader criminal justice community so that people understood the kind of context that they're looking at. I'll wrap up. I want to say that these are kind of the things that we're starting to do. We started, but we have no intention of stopping. We understand now that this is kind of a continuous process for us, and we look for feedback from people who use our data, including the people on this call. We are, one of the things I haven't shown is data on courts, prosecutors, and public defense. We are wrapping up our first successful data collections in each of those 3 areas over the next several months. And so stay tuned for more data from us on that side of things. And one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to leverage administrative data. So data collected by the Middlesex County District Attorney's Office, for example, would be data that if we can work with your office, instead of asking you questions like number of cases that you prosecute, what the kind of bail arrangements or bail suggestions were, we would just ask for your data and protect the data, protect the identity of the people in the data, but try to figure out how to answer questions consistently across the country, because different jurisdictions are collecting data in different ways. So one of the challenges for us is kind of trying to harmonize all of those data sets. And, we're trying to do all of this while trying to adhere to the best statistical practices. But one of those is to the timely release of data. We understand that criminal justice is a rapidly changing policy field, and data to address policymakers' concerns, to support researchers, but also to inform affected communities is something that we believe strongly that we should be able to provide to the community. All right. I'm going to go ahead and answer questions. I'm happy to answer those questions here. And I'm also going to invite you to email me. But one thing I want to say about emailing me is that, first of all, there's another Kevin Scott in the Department of Justice, and he is tired of getting my emails. His is the one without the M in the middle. So what I would encourage you to do is to email askbjs@usdoj.gov. We really do have statisticians waiting to answer your call. So if you email that address, your question will get routed to a statistician. And if we have an answer for you, we will get you that answer. And so, you don't have to get lost in our tools or in our data sets or in our publications. One of the things that our statisticians do as part of their jobs is they help people out. So I would encourage you to email askbjs@usdoj.gov, and we'll get the answer. The question will go to the right person, and the answer will come back.
Thank you, Kevin. That excuse me, that was really an amazing array of tools and information, which I know some of which I had not heard about before, and I'm sure is true for other of our panelists. One question before, and I'm going to collect questions and distribute all of your information, but the impact of political motivations on wanting to paint a picture of crime in this country is certainly not new. But I would guess that when it's happening alongside the rise of social media and disinformation and misinformation raises the stakes. Can you talk just for a minute about sort of what the Department of Justice is doing to counter that, how you're using your standards to make sure people are seeing real data, and what's kind of the tension that exists in that area?
Sure. I mean, I think that the broader environment is one that I think that we all live in, and we can't kind of, even as an independent federal statistical agency, we can't kind of stick our heads in the sand and not be aware of that environment. And I think that one of the things that we can do is, we can provide context and our objective analysis of what we're seeing in the data. We can't prevent every misuse or, tweet that misconstrues a BJS publication or a BJS table or a BJS chart. People are going to do that. But try to make as broadly as possible available what we're doing and try to provide the context in a neutral and apolitical way. And I think that one of the things that I really like, one of the things I've really enjoyed about my time at BJS is that the people who work here, that's what we believe in. That's kind of our one article, shared article of faith, is the objectivity of our data and our presentation of those data.
All right, I'm going to distribute Kevin's information. I love the fact that there are statisticians standing by to answer your questions. And thank you so much for being a part of this work with us today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Really grateful. Thank you. We're going to turn now to Dr. Rebecca Dunlea, who is an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at UMass Lowell. And her research really focuses on exactly what we've been talking about, the inequalities and inefficiencies in courtroom outcomes, many of those, most notably those related to prosecution, racial and ethnic differences, and agency-level justice policy. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being here. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, District Attorney Ryan. I am delighted to be here, especially since I am local to Middlesex County. So this is an especially, enjoyable summit for me. So hello, everybody. Again, my name is Rebecca Dunlea. I am a professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. I am also one of the co-managers of the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators Project, which is a national research and technical assistance project working with prosecutors to better collect, use, and facilitate data-informed decision-making. So let's see if I can effectively share this screen. Go to presenter mode here. All right, so hopefully you are looking at the correct screen now. All right, so a little bit about who we are. Again, we're a research and technical assistance team. So there are 4 of us that co-manage this project. 3 of us are professors and 1 of us is a former prosecutor. And we work with prosecutorial agencies across the country that are interested in primarily 2 very important facets of modern prosecution: data transparency and racial justice. So we have about somewhere between 25 and 30 partner offices right now. We span about 11 states. And though a lot of our work, we've been doing this project since about 2018, a lot of our work has focused on partnerships with individual offices. But recently we've gotten into trying to figure out what kind of statewide projects might offer in terms of economies of scale. So if rather than working with 1 prosecutor's office in a state, we can get 5 or 10 or even 15 or more offices, what kind of additional benefits can a project add? What kind of efficiencies can we figure out that will make sort of data-informed decision-making and data-informed prosecution more of a reality in more parts of the United States? So at the center of our work are the PPIs, which our project is named for. They are a suite. It's free, by the way. If you visit our website, I should say this now. If you visit our website, theppis.org, you can find information and a number of completely free resources about how to initiate and implement a data project, to collect data for the first time, to analyze data for the first time, how to find a local research partner that might help you do a data project for the first time. It's all available on our website. Again, that's www.theppis.org. So the indicators are a suite of 55 specific performance metrics that measure office level prosecutorial performance. So we do not attempt and we do not endorse trying to figure out, well, is this one ADA doing better than that one? Is that ADA, do they have a high rate of conviction or diversion or whatever it is, higher or lower than that other person? We're interested in office level performance. And the idea behind these PPIs is to move beyond very traditional views of what it means to show success in the area of prosecution. So I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, but there's so much more that prosecutors do beyond just convicting people and sending them to jail or prison, right? So with the PPIs, we try to get at a wider range of activities that prosecutors are doing on a regular basis in order to show and kind of demonstrate to the public what the priorities of the office are and what the full range of activities is. So the PPIs are organized under these 9 objectives that you see on the screen right now. The green objectives relate to areas of capacity and efficiency, right? So there are some PPIs that measure things like diversity of staff, diversity of line and management attorneys. There are capacity and efficiency indicators related to time and resource prioritization. So what kinds of cases are receiving more attention in the office? Timeliness of case processing has been a big one for all the offices that we worked with in the past couple of years as well. In the middle, the red objectives relate to community safety and well-being. So that's tapping into how serious crime is being addressed by the office, how victims are being served and protected and treated through case processing, and also what kind of activities an office is engaging in with the community. So what does that outreach look like? How many different individuals in the office are participating in community activities? Things like that. The last set of indicators, the last 3 objectives, relate to fairness and justice. So a big part of our work is furthering racial justice, identifying differences by racial and ethnic groups, as well as by socioeconomic groups, and then figuring out kind of what the underlying causes and policies that can create those differences are, and how we might be able to make just tiny tweaks or tiny policy changes that will help improve and reduce those differences moving forward. We also have indicators related to minimizing unnecessary punitiveness, bearing in mind that there are cases for which punitive sentences and punitive outcomes are very, very appropriate. But where do we kind of draw the line? And those cases where you could go either way, what are we doing with those, and how can we improve outcomes for defendants and victims in those cases? And the last section relates to prosecutorial ethics and integrity as well. So there are 55 indicators. On our website, we have data showing examples of these indicators for as many as we've been able to populate across our partner offices. So far, no office that we've worked with has been able to create all 55. And the idea is that these are to be customizable. We want this data, we want these indicators to start a conversation, not to be the thing that dictate what goes on, an external facing dashboard. So we hope that these kind of trigger conversations about, well, what do we do on a daily basis that we want the public, that we want our community stakeholders to be able to see and understand that we're doing? What priorities do we have internally that we want to use data to communicate to the public and to say, look, we've been putting, say, a focus on diversion programming for low-level offenders, for nonviolent offenders, or maybe even for some low-level violent offenders, right? How can we use data to show that that's been a priority for us and to show how we've increased our usage of those diversion programs over time? A couple of sample indicators to show you what this looks like. Like Dr. Scott said, I think it's better not to kind of like demo the website, which we could do. We have a number of partner offices who have published publicly available dashboards. Links to those are available from our website under our list of partners. But so instead I grabbed a couple of screenshots just to show you what these metrics might look like if you or your office decided to produce an external facing dashboard yourself. So one example of a PPI we have is about reserving incarceration for serious offenders. And one of our partner offices, specifically in Portland, Oregon, was very interested in this indicator because post-COVID, they realized that they had, it is clear from this chart, they had begun reserving incarceration only for felony offenders, and they wanted to keep things that way. Like it was a necessity immediately after COVID hit. Court closures and restrictions meant that they were only allowed to try only the most serious cases, but they kind of liked what that did to the distribution of incarceration sentences in the office. So since that time, they've tracked how many of their incarceration sentences went to more versus less serious offense convictions. And they are very pleased to find that they're currently issuing a much, much greater portion of their incarceration sentences for serious offenders than they were pre-COVID. That's an example of a PPI that kind of demonstrates what has become a priority for that office. And they're able to communicate that and show, look, this is something we wanted to focus on, and this is how well we've been doing it. Another example, this is again a big one and tends to resonate with offices right now. Post-COVID, post-court closures, case backlogs are crazy in a lot of places, even now, a couple years after the pandemic started. So the time to disposition, the time that it takes to resolve a case has gone up probably in the majority of prosecutors' offices across the country. So we have PPIs that relate to how much time it takes for cases to reach disposition. Jacksonville, Florida is particularly interested in this, and they've been monitoring it pretty closely since the pandemic started. One other example is a PPI that I screenshotted from the dashboard one of the dashboards of a partner we've worked with in Colorado, the 18th Judicial Circuit. So a number of the PPIs do relate to racial differences in outcomes. So this one these bars show differences over time in racial and ethnic differences in deferred judgment, right? So the office is able to track on a year-over-year basis, what do these differences look like? And the idea is that if over time differences are getting larger, then maybe we treat that like a red flag and we start investigating why. Are we giving fewer deferred judgment because the makeup of offenses has changed and people of color are committing different crimes? Has it changed because somehow we're issuing a different number of deferred judgments, or we've changed our eligibility for that disposition? Like those are the kinds of questions that we help offices ask once they've measured this data. As DA Ryan mentioned earlier, right, you can collect data, you can put it on a website, you can make it look really pretty, but it's not really useful unless you use it to guide decision-making, to guide policy changes. So these indicators are all about kind of raising flags, either green flags, like, great, we're doing a good job, we implemented this policy, and now we're seeing the positive consequences from it. You can get neutral PPIs, things that say, oh, okay, like, we're holding about where we wanted to, we're doing well in this particular area, or it might identify red flags for you, things where you want to investigate further moving forward and take a deeper dive into the data. Now, some of the fun parts of initiating data projects are the detours, right? So we've had a number of successful partnerships over the past 5 years. But honestly, one of the most fun parts of it is when we start to work with folks in an office and everybody starts getting comfortable with the idea of trusting in data to help make decisions and to help kind of not fully drive decision making, but just be an extra tool in that toolbox. People tend to start coming up with their own ideas or start articulating or voicing these questions that they have themselves. They're like, actually, this thing that's been going on for years has been nagging me. And now that I'm seeing that we can use data to look at these other types of decisions that we're making, I'm wondering, do you think that we could use data to figure out this problem and to figure out how to solve this problem that my unit has had, or that I've had, or that the entire office has had? Those project detours are the most fun for us, especially when they're mostly led by the office themselves. So a couple examples of project detours that we found to be very successful in the offices that initiated them. We did a project a couple of years ago with one partner who realized over the course of working with us to extract data from their case management system that their disposition codes were absolutely insane and were useless. They were essentially meaningless because they had 330 different disposition codes. And in their case management system, every time a case is rejected at filing or dismissed after filing, there has to be a reason code included with the disposition. So every rejection has to have a reason. Every dismissal has to have a reason. There were 330 different codes being used on an annual basis in that jurisdiction. But really, the two that were most commonly used were very generic. They were improbability of conviction and lack of evidence. And they told the office very little about what the actual issue was in the case. So through a rather rigorous process, we helped create a working group within the office that revised the rejection and disposition and dismissal codes. We got the list down from 330 to 48. Which they implemented during COVID in August 2020. And they've had great success since then in using those codes to assess changes in why cases are being rejected and why cases are being dismissed. So for example, they found that there's been an increase post-COVID in rejections and dismissals due to witness cooperation issues, which I think reflects broader trends in kind of what's happening in the relationship between law enforcement and the communities post-COVID. But knowing that the issue with rising rejection dismissal rates is witness-based means that the office can begin targeting efforts to improve relationships with the community and improve, case outcomes where they feel filing and convictions are necessary. Another example of a project detour, early on in a project, we were providing basic descriptive information about, here's how many cases you're moving a year. Here's the kind of distribution of decision-making and dispositions. And we always play somewhat of a guessing game, right? The first time we go to an office with data, we say, okay, what do you think your conviction rate is? What do you think your diversion rate is? What do you think your filing rate is for felonies versus misdemeanors, something like that? And this is true across offices. Whenever we ask that of diversion, most folks tend to overestimate the actual percentage of cases that get diverted in their office to one program or another. So in one office where they expected to find a much higher diversion rate than was actually present, they wanted to dig further into why their perception of diversion was so different from what the actual diversion rate was. And they ended up finding that the issue was that many defendants were listed as rejecting diversion offers. It wasn't that prosecutors weren't using diversion and making offers. It was the defendants were rejecting them, which was very odd, and they weren't sure why. The underlying reason, which it took a while to figure out, was that many diversion offers were being sent via paper mail to the most recent address listed on the defendant's file. The problem was many defendants have relocated by the time these letters get sent. Many of the addresses are old or not actually a residential address. So whenever an offer gets returned to the office, gets returned to sender, it gets marked as a diversion rejection. So they realized that diversion acceptance was really low because many defendants weren't actually getting the offers. So they went through steps to eliminate the paper mail situation and figure out how to better communicate offers so that defendants knew that they were being, the offer was being made. Last really quick one, we had an office where when we created a PPI for them related to how much time it was taking for them to reach disposition, they thought that post-COVID they had gotten their their case backlog had been reduced quite dramatically. They felt that their caseload was much more manageable, but somehow cases were still taking a really long time to dispose of. And they wondered why that was. They said, we seem to have, for the most part, gotten everything else under control post-pandemic, now that we're fully back in operation. So why are we still taking so long to make decisions? And at the end of the day, what they discovered, with help from a little bit of data and ruling out a number of alternatives, was that the fact that staff turnover in the office was so high post-COVID, new attorneys were handling a much larger portion of the caseload than they had been in previous years. And what that meant was that a large portion of the caseload was being handled by people who were not confident yet about their decision-making. So new attorneys were handling the majority of cases in the office, but nobody was teaching them how to make efficient and very definitive decisions. So they were kind of punting the small decisions that they needed to make down the road, and time to disposition in cases that could have been resolved in a matter of weeks were ending up taking months, or what could have been months ended up taking years. So those are just a few examples of the projects that kind of the side work that's come out of our PPI projects. Those are really enjoyable for us, and I think those hold specific and very special meaning to the offices, because they're kind of those questions that have been nagging folks for a long time. So I will stop there. If you are part of an office that might be interested in working with us, or you think there's any kind of help that we can provide, please feel free to reach out. We do have a general inquiry form on our website, or please feel free to email me directly. My email is there on the screen. And thank you for your time. I think you're muted, dear Ryan. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I see that we had someone raising their hand with the question, and I have some other questions that have come in, but is that Judith who has her hand raised? Did you want to pose a question? Maybe, no? Megan?
The hand raised.
Yeah. Okay, let me start. I have a couple of questions that have come in. You talked a lot about the inequalities and the inefficiencies, and everybody who's done this for a long time sees that happen. But, joining us today are prosecutors from my office, prosecutors from other offices, including, I believe, from Denver and others throughout Massachusetts. But given that audience, what are some of the most salient takeaways that you've learned? And what advice would you share about what prosecutors, especially you identified a really key point, which is younger prosecutors, what should they be focused on to reduce disparities and inequalities?
So we take one thing that we've found, and this is kind of going to be a circular way to answer the question. We've found that the folks that hold the most power in the office, other than the executive team, it's the mid-level managers. So mid-level managers they kind of have a policy mindset, and they're kind of in line with the executive team in that way, that they're thinking about more than just, oh, what's this decision on this case and what does that need to be? But they also receive a lot of very valuable on-the-ground information from the line staff that they work with directly. So new attorneys, I think in terms of racial disparities, the most progress that we've seen in recent years comes not from individuals. I know implicit bias is a big thing. It's a buzzword in the field right now. And we probably all do have some kind of bias that we can recognize and figure out whether it's affecting our decisions. We found that the largest changes in disparity come after policy shifts, on focusing more on systemic racism, sexism, whatever socioeconomic differences it is, more than focusing on an individual's decisions and an individual's biases. That said, new attorneys who are spending a lot of time in court, who see the goings on, who see defendants and how they act, who see how judges are moving cases down the line and whatnot, they're the ones that provide that on-the-ground observation and that kind of on-the-ground information that helps figure out where disparities are actually coming from. So we advocate for thinking about how institutional policies and such might be able to affect, say, eligibility for diversion. Like maybe the problem, a lot of offices have racial differences in diversion, right? Due to eligibility, due to acceptance. due to lower trust in the justice system as a whole, people of color are less likely to end up in diversion programs in the majority of places that we've worked. And it's not so much about telling an individual line attorney, like, you need to say, make more offers to individuals of color, but changing diversion eligibility to increase the number and type of offenses that become eligible for diversion. We often see that those types of changes have bigger effects on differences.
Thank you. I think Megan is going to let us have a question. Maybe.
Judith, you should be able to ask your question now.
Technology is not our friend today. Judith, can you hear us? All right, maybe while we work that piece out, I have a couple of other questions that have come in. Doctor, you've had really a bird's eye view on how prosecutorial performance indicators, that model, how it's been implemented across the country. New Orleans, Denver, New York City, so many places. And could you tell us a little bit about the perspective you've gained and what you've seen in really tangible ways in your research about why it's important to use data when you're creating policies? Like, what have you seen? I know you mentioned a little bit how people sort of think data has become my friend and I can use that. But what else have you learned about how that, I think in most prosecutors' offices, as in many places, people cringe a little bit when we start saying we're going to work really hard on our data. How have you seen that change as people are doing it?
Right. Well, so even in what we think of data informed, like using data should be nonpartisan, right? And we work with offices across the political spectrum, and we pride ourselves on doing that because it shouldn't be a liberal thing or a conservative thing or anything like that. But regardless of where kind of the office or where the elected attorney falls on the spectrum, there is typically still a large amount of fear among many participants in the project when we start up a new partnership. And the fear comes from, oh my gosh, I think I know how to do my job, but it's really hard to quantify that in using data, right? Like there's no one number that represents how good my decision making is. There's no way that all the data in the world is not going to tell you how well I'm making appropriate decisions. And what we've seen over the past couple of years is the process of changing that fear and kind of reducing that skepticism has gotten easier. I think it's more part of the national conversation to talk about data. It's people are becoming more familiar with the idea of data to inform decisions. Again, not to drive decisions. This is not a situation where we can eventually have like AI-driven prosecution, but just using data as an extra tool in the toolbox. Folks have become much more open to that in recent years. And I think as more offices start to publicly talk about like, oh, we have a dashboard, or like Middlesex County does, we release our raw data, do with it what you will. That fear has kind of subsided a little bit because there haven't been as large or as many negative repercussions as people always think that there's going to be. The fear is that it's going to be used to fire me or it's going to bring a lot of negative press to the office or something like that. We rarely see that in practice. As long as you use proactive messaging to kind of frame the conversation the way you want it to go, its data projects are typically pretty positive.
Okay. And your publication in criminology on color blindness and the cultural scripts in prosecution, maybe you can talk just a little bit about that for people who haven't seen the article, and I know we put that in the chat as well, speaks to how important it is to, and this comes from the top down in an office, really fostering a culture where there's real value given to let's see if we have disparity. If we have disparity, what are the root causes of that? If we as prosecutors want to be a piece of that, fixing that problem. And we don't know what we can't measure. And so could you talk to us a little bit about that research, what you saw, and then maybe a little bit, since you did that research in 2021, what else you've seen about how prosecutors can really alleviate the problem of racial disparities?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're referencing, yeah, an article that was published in Criminology, which is a peer-reviewed journal in the field of criminology. So we academics submit our papers and whatnot. So the paper is about color blindness, and it's based on data from 2 prosecutors' offices in Florida. But to be perfectly honest, that's where we got the data. I could have done that study using most any office data that, for any partner that we've worked with. Many of the scripts that we identified in that study, we hear all over the place. So the idea is that color blindness is a very popular concept across law enforcement agencies, right? So there have been a number of studies that found that law enforcement officers very proudly and confidently say, yes, we are supposed to be colorblind. We are not supposed to acknowledge even that a person has a racial or ethnic identity. Like, the idea is that if we are ignoring people's race and ethnicity, then we can't possibly be adding to or perpetuating racial disparity. Like, we know racial disparities exist, but the best that I can do is to ignore a person's race and make the decision that's appropriate as if everybody were the same race, for example. And there are a number of kind of rationales that prosecutors, that law enforcement, that judges, there's been other work on color blindness, even in Massachusetts. There are these different rationalizations that individual attorneys and officers use to kind of justify why color blindness makes the most sense in prosecution. So it's things like, from a prosecutor's perspective, well, like, if I get cases that are racially disproportionate, like, there's nothing I can do about it. Like, I don't build the plane, I just fly it, right? Law enforcement builds the case. If they're building crappier cases against people of color, that's not something that I can necessarily change. Another one would be, well, we get cases more from some parts of the city than others. And if those parts of the city are disproportionately resided in by people of color, like, that's not something that I can really adjust for. Like, my job is to look at the case file and to make the best decision based on the information in front of me in that case file. The problem is, that's kind of what I think of as a myopic view, that there are a lot of institutional ways that kind of people of color have been, for decades or for even centuries, like, funneled more often into the criminal justice system. So color blindness can actually make racial disparities worse rather than improve them. The study was done a couple years ago. I'm fairly confident that I could publish the same I would obtain the same findings doing a similar study now. So it's about figuring out how you move past that color blindness idea to thinking about, okay, I understand this defendant is a person of color. That doesn't mean that I'm automatically going to give, a more lenient plea offer, or I'm just going to give more diversion offers or anything like that. We're not going to implement affirmative action programs. But we can look at particular offense types where people of color are predominantly, being prosecuted and convicted. And we can see if, as a whole, that type of offense and that type of outcome makes sense, or whether we need to make adjustments. Other office level policies are kind of where we focus, and where I focus on addressing that type of color blindness.
Thank you. Alice, did you have a question?
I do. Thank you. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. So when you talked about these issues that were resolved, the 300 different disposition codes,
Yeah.
Or the offers being returned in the mail for diversion, were those things that you detected, like, after your organization got involved, or did those DA's offices say, we have this problem, can you help us solve it? Like, could you just walk us through a little bit, like, how it was that you partnered with them to determine sort of why those things were, like, how you figured out the solution to those problems?
Yeah, so it differs based on the project. So the disposition codes, like that office was actually one of our pilot offices while we were just starting up the program, trying to figure out like back in 2018, like how do we partner with the prosecutor's office? We don't have many good examples of this so far. Like, so what are the key elements to make it successful? They signed on to do a public facing dashboard. And then as we started digging into the data more, they realized they had a ton of questions that maybe data could be useful for answering. In that example, the disposition codes issue, they've known for a while that it was a problem. They've known that 330 codes didn't make any sense. There was tons of overlapping codes. There were 2 codes where there would be a couple of word or letters different. But for the most part, it was just whichever code people chose to use at that moment. So it was a problem that they knew existed. And then as we got into it, they were like, oh, hey, we have this other thing. We haven't really liked it. We know it's causing some problems. Us doing this data work with you is showing us that maybe there's actually solutions that will make this information more useful. Is there anything we can do about it? And then we're able to say, hey, why don't we take this approach? That's actually, I said it varies by site. That's generally how it's worked. We either create a PPI, an indicator that somebody is really surprised by, and then they want to know more about it, or it's kind of an issue that's been in the back of their mind for a while. They just haven't really felt the motivation or had the time to address it. But once we start the partnership and we create that space to say, hey, what are your other gripes? What are some other things that we can help you do to make your job more efficient? Then those start coming up and we say, actually, we have something that might be helpful for you.
Thank you. Other questions that people either want to raise a hand for or put in the chat for Dr. Donnelly? You've been wonderful. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time. Anything?
Oh, no, thank you.
Thank you. All right, and we put that article in the chat. We'll put the information in the chat. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
I appreciate it. Thank you, dear Ryan.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure to welcome here this morning District Attorney Beth McCann, who is the District Attorney in Denver. And as you've heard, that office was involved in some of this research that took place, and District Attorney McCann became the district attorney was elected in November of 2016, took office in January of 17. Something that always makes me happy, becoming the first female DA in Denver's history. And as often is the case when women take these jobs, she came to the job with really a wealth of experience. She'd been a DA for a long time. She'd been at the Attorney General's office. She had been the Director of Public Safety, done a lot of work with juveniles, with diversion, and then had become a member of the legislature in Colorado, and then came to this office and has really committed to what so many of us are working to do: identify those disparities that we see, correct those disparities, lessen the weight of the criminal justice system on many of the people that we see who have violated a criminal statute but are not necessarily the most serious of criminals. And they've also done an incredible job in working on their data and really making that information available. You heard about some of the work they've done in identifying things. So it's really, I know how busy you are, truly, and it is my great pleasure to meet you and to welcome you here today, District Attorney McCann.
Thank you, District Attorney Ryan, another female district attorney. There are more and more of us, which is amazing. I just saw the female district attorney in Chester County, Pennsylvania, talking about capturing the fellow who had escaped and was dangerous. So that was good news this morning. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to try to share my screen and see if that works. And if it doesn't, I'll just talk anyway. But just as by way of introduction, when I started in 2017, we weren't really keeping track of much data. I mean, we had like our total numbers of cases filed, and we could distinguish the types of cases and things of that nature. But we weren't really looking at things like race and ethnicity and some of our time it takes to resolve a felony case. How are we resolving our cases? How many deferred judgments, which is our plea where someone pleads, but then they're on probation for 2 years and then the case is dismissed. So we wanted to look into some of those things. So I started initially with a study just of my office where we had a professor come in from the University of Colorado with graduate students and look at 1 year's worth of data for race and ethnicity, because that was something that I had talked about in my campaign. So she was able to prepare data for that 1 year period. We were looking at how we disposed of cases, mostly it wasn't, we weren't doing charging decisions as such, but how were we disposing of them? Because I wanted to see if there was discrimination going on in my office in terms of how we were handling cases. And the results of that study showed there were a couple areas. One of them was that deferred judgment, that we were not, that people of color were not receiving deferred judgments as much as white people. And also we were dismissing more cases against Black defendants than other races, which we wanted to learn, was that because we were filing cases that we shouldn't be filing, or was it because they were dispoing cases together, so one case got dismissed and so forth. So anyway, a long story short, we brought in some interns to look into all of those cases that involved deferred judgments and dismissals, where they had to actually manually go through and look those cases up and determine if there was legitimate reason for the difference. And we concluded that, at least for that year, there were understandable and legitimate reasons for differences, but it continued to be an area that I was concerned about and wanted to look at. And then we were very lucky here, and I'll start my PowerPoint if I can, because the Microsoft Justice Project, funded through PPI, your previous speaker was talking about PPI, a project here in Colorado that would enable, we started with 8 DA's offices that would enable us to develop more sophisticated dashboards. So let me talk about that a little bit, if I can share the screen, but now I have to, they put a new, I have a new Windows thing on here, and it may not work, but I will try.
Technology has not been our great friend today. I think we all have that update, and we've been trying to work through it.
Yeah. I'm not sure where, it's stored on my, let me see if it's in SharePoint. It's stored, but when I stored it, it did not have this, kind of, okay, yes, we want to do that. Okay. Let me see if I can find it. It may not be in here in a way that I can find it. I know where it is, but it's not showing up. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but.
Is it somewhere that you can just email it to us?
Yes, I can do that.
All right, Madeline, Megan, if you can help us a little bit.
Yeah, let me do that. Hang on a second. I'll find that, and then yeah, I was afraid this would happen because I'm at a conference, so I don't have access to my regular IT people.
And we're happy to help with that. This is the miracle of technology, is that you can be at the conference and be with us. The downside of technology is trying to figure this piece out.
Yeah, okay, I'm just about there. Yeah, when you're in your office, you can just have that IT person right there by your side, and they can do these things. But all right, course, now it's not showing up where it's supposed to be. So I don't know. I may have to just keep talking.
Okay, that's fine too. And if we figure it out, we figure it out.
Yeah, and I can certainly send it to you later if you want to.
And we'll distribute it to everybody, not a problem.
Yeah. Okay. So let me go back to where it was. Oh no, I think
And we are fine for time, so don't stress. We're good.
okay. All right. Well, anyway, so what we did was work with Microsoft Justice Project with PPI, and they were able to provide us with a professor from Loyola University in Chicago, and he's done some work. His name is Don Steeman. He's done some work with different DA's offices around the country. And we also partnered with a local, the University of Denver has a evaluation lab, they call it, which is kind of a research data lab. And she had helped, the woman there had helped us on my individual race and justice study. So we looped her into this data project. And so the 8 different DA's offices throughout the state participated. One of the things that's unique about Colorado is that all of the DA's offices use the same case management system. So, and it's a unique to Colorado system. And that's, I think, something that made Colorado attractive to PPI and the Microsoft people, because we could easily establish codes and definitions and things of that nature for all of the DA's offices that were participating, because we all had the same case management system. And so what they did is spent about a year coming up with, I noticed your previous speaker was talking about having all these codes. And that was the case with all the DA's offices having different codes, or they were the same codes, but DA's offices used them differently. And there were way too many for like the kind of crime. And we also had an issue because the statute defines violent crime in one way, but Denver Police Department defines violent crime a little bit differently. And so we had to come to agreement on what would be considered a violent crime, and how would we use that across all 8 district attorney offices. And so that took the development of definitions and how we were going to use various categories of crime, and what did we really want to measure. That took a long time, at least a year, probably a little over a year. But again, like looking at, you know, are we going to be able to track refusals in our database and the reason for refusals? That was something that I was interested in, because we refused almost 30% of the cases that Denver police present to us. And so we wanted to be able to track them in a more discerning way. We were tracking them like generally not enough evidence to prove or can't prove the case. But that doesn't really tell you anything. Like, is it because of a victim? Is it because witnesses have disappeared? We wanted to drill down on that. So we now have a drop-down menu in our database where those who we have an intake unit, they're filling out the reason for refusals, which in more detail, which they didn't like. The attorneys don't like having to do that, but I think it's helpful to get that kind of information. And then, you know, we looked at, again, what are violent crimes? What aren't violent crimes? How are we categorizing things? And how many codes do we really need? Because as we all know, the data you get out is only as good as the data you put in. And so we were not getting a lot of consistent data entry. Our legal secretaries do most of the data entry, but it was not consistent because we had so many codes. People would choose different codes for different reasons. And so that was a big thing, was working through all that. And then, so we have been able now to launch the dashboards. They launched a year ago in September of 2022. And a big effort has been made to try to get that out into the community. We sent, a lot of emails about it. We did tried to get a lot of press about it. And then we've made presentations like to City Council. One of the presentations at this conference has to do with those data dashboards. And I was just learning that one of the other counties has taken the data and shown it to judges to help them in terms of race and ethnic issues, but also just disposition of cases, how long cases are taking to resolve. We haven't done that yet, but I think listening to her talk about what they're doing, I think we will schedule a presentation for all of our judges. And then the way they did it was they suggested if a judge wanted to see their individual data, they would contact the DA's office. They presented the data in aggregate. I know Washington State, you may be familiar with, they have a system where they have actually publicized data on individual judges and showing discrepancies for how people are treated based on race and ethnicity. We haven't done that in Colorado, and I'm not sure we would do that publicly, but it was interesting talking to that DA because I asked her how many judges asked to have the follow-up. And she said a couple of judges did, but then they never followed up. So none of the judges wanted to know their individual record, which is sort of too bad. But anyway, so we're thinking about how to do that in a way that would be effective with the court. We've also developed, and each DA's office has developed an internal dashboard. And so we are looking at things like caseload for individual attorneys. We're beginning now to look at time it takes an individual attorney to dispose a case. And we anticipate looking at perhaps the kinds of dispositions that they have, the number of trials they have. And we'll have to make a decision about how we want to use that data because we don't want it to be, big brother is watching you. And especially with this new generation of younger lawyers, they have I think a different way of looking at work. We're used to coming to work 8 to 5 or whatever, and being in the office, and these young people work more remotely. They're more interested in just getting the work done and not so much, having the usual requirements, I guess, of being in the office and things of that nature. So we have to figure out how do we want to use that data, and maybe meeting individually with attorneys with the eye toward helping them improve, noting that their caseload is that they're not resolving cases very quickly, or that they are resolving too many cases and perhaps they need to get some trial experience, but in a way that's more lifting them up instead of, comparing people. So we're developing the internal dashboard for things of that nature to help us look at the trends and whether we should be doing a better job internally. But the dashboards are very useful because you can look at things like we've looked at our homicide filing rates, because we were getting a lot of criticism about, well, it wasn't us so much, but just in general, law enforcement's been getting criticism about the crime wave or the increase in crime. So we were able to look at the fact that we were filing a lot more homicides in 2021 and 2022. So we were responding to the rise in homicides in Denver. And we also had an issue about possession of weapon by a previous offender. that the police department felt we were not prosecuting those aggressively enough. So we were able to take our data and show that, in fact, we had a big increase in filings in those kinds of cases as well. So it's very helpful with, public, being able to show the public, this is what we're doing, and answer questions that they have. It was interesting. I think initially there was quite a bit of interest in the public, but it's really kind of dropped off. Our dashboard is on our website, but we don't see a lot of people visiting it too much. We do refer people to it when they have questions, but I think it's hard for people to understand, criminal justice data and put it into context. So we're still in the beginning stages, really, of seeing how far we can go with this data development. They've now added 4 more DA's offices to this project. And the hope is that we'll continue to be able to add some of the more rural, smaller agencies to the project. And we'll continue to determine how best to use the data that we do develop and use it in a positive way. I think a lot of people are interested in the race and ethnicity data, and as is true, I think in most places, our data does show that there is a disproportionate representation of people of color in our filings based on their population in Denver. So that's an area that, I want to make sure that in our office, once we get the case, we are handling it. We are handling them in a way that is not race-based or ethnic-based, and that we are treating people equally as we look at their cases. So that's a big interest of mine in making sure that people in the office are cognizant of issues around race and cultural differences, and that's some of the things that we're going to be looking at as we move forward, making sure that the office is doing a good job that way. But I think for any office, we're just in Denver anyway, the DA's offices have been kind of insular and not really community oriented and not willing to share data. And so this has been a big move for Colorado to have now the ability for people to look on our websites and see what kinds of cases we're filing, see how long it takes to dispose of felonies, what kinds of plea bargains are we arriving at, that and the representation of races and ethnic backgrounds. And I think that's just been a huge step forward. And I think we will see that. Obviously, you're interested in it, DA Ryan, and I think the interest is growing all over the country in having better data for the public and for our own internal use. So I think I will stop talking and see if there's some questions or if there are particular areas that people are interested in that I could address more.
So one of the things I was interested to see was that on your website about the dashboard, you make that point. I mean, it says no data point provides all the information you need. It's important to look at different data points. While dashboards are good at identifying what's happening, getting to the why is a deeper question. And you have it. I really liked this piece. You have a data story section for a deep dive in a post in a particular topic. But will you tell us, do you think people use that? Is that useful for your staff in trying to think about, okay, we maybe are doing less or more of something. Are we really looking at the why? Has that been successful in that piece?
I would say that we are really just beginning to do that deeper dive. We have a working group in the office that is taking up topics. And so that working group is not just attorneys, but also investigators and victim advocates and secretarial staff. And so we are now just tasking them with taking a deeper dive into that deferred judgment area, because we noticed, I mentioned in our first study, which was 2017 data, we noticed this issue with deferred judgment. But just in the last year, there's been a dramatic increase in the gap between people of color and white people who get deferred judgments. So we are now going to convene and have our managers, our chief deputies, talk about what is going on with deferred judgments. You know, some people say that often they'll make not often, but sometimes they make an offer of a deferred judgment, and the defendant and the defense attorney prefer to take a misdemeanor plea straight up than to do a deferred to a felony. Couple reasons. One is with the misdemeanor, they may serve 10 days in jail, they're done. And also with the deferred, they're on probation for a period of time, and there's concern that they won't successfully complete the probation, and then they end up with a felony. So we don't know if that's part of that's the problem, you know, with just a data piece. We don't know if our folks are not offering deferred judgments to people of color as much as they offer them to white people, or is it more that they offer but it's not taken? So we need to kind of figure out how do we use that data piece in a way that will be instructive. And you know, we've learned through this process that, of course, one of the things we look at is criminal history. People of color may have more criminal history, but we need to have a discussion in our office about how do we look at that, and is that really fair if someone has some older cases that have been resolved? Is that really, do we really want to say, okay, you don't get a deferred judgment for that? And developing guidelines that are sensitive to cultural issues. So I would say the jury's out on how effective it's going to be in terms of changing behavior in the office. We're in the process of really using this working group to figure out how do we best use this data. And as I mentioned, with the internal dashboard, I think we have to be very thoughtful about how we roll that out, so it is not perceived as, you know, all we care about is your caseload or how many trials you have. Really, we want to look overall at how do you dispose your cases? Are you being fair? Are you handling things the way you should? And again, you know, some data points are not as useful until you really dive in. So yes, that's a long answer and convoluted.
That's helpful. That's helpful. But, you know, we've had the same experience, I would say, here in Massachusetts. There, probably before 2017, 18, there was really no data sharing. We've tried very hard to share data. I would say that's not always the case across the state, and it's hard for people to interpret it. Have you had sort of any experience of like that data leading to community conversation or participation, or is that something you're working on?
So I have a couple of advisory councils that are comprised of, it's a smaller group, but people who are representative of the community. And I've shown it to all of them, and they have liked seeing the data, but they haven't really, it hasn't resulted in them making suggestions or in a, I would say, concrete action. I think what it has done is demonstrate to the community that we are being transparent and that we do want to open up our office to community review and community examination. And I think that's been a very positive result. People now realize that, in fact, they do have access to our data. And that we are willing to share and have those community discussions. When all of them went live on the same day in September of last year, after that we did have a big community meeting with all the DA's offices that were participating and community representatives. And I think that was a very positive, we got very positive response and very positive response from the press. The press did do a couple of articles about these data dashboards. And so I think it has helped significantly in generally the relationship with the community, but it has not led specifically to like, here's an action item that's coming out of the community. Part of it, I think, is, as I said, it's complicated data. And, as you know, many people really don't understand what happens in a DA's office. They don't really know what we do. And so, that's also been a little bit of a difficulty, I think, for a lay person just going on and looking at the website and saying, oh, I see this, you need to be doing something about that. But I think Denver has a separate working group called Reimagining Public Safety and Policing. And that's a big group that I've worked with on various pieces of the criminal justice system. And they are still active and still working on coming up with suggestions. So, yeah, I would say it's had a positive impact, but not a specific impact.
So you mentioned that in Denver, in Colorado, all of the DA's offices share the same system. We do that here in Massachusetts as well. I would say it is a system that nobody likes. It is clunky. It really began as a case tracking rather than a data gathering. We've made adjustments to that. It probably needs a huge upgrade to be able to be more successful. And, as I mentioned, you came to this job having spent 4 terms in the legislature. You'd really championed lots of criminal justice measures, lots of work in this area. I think as DAs, we have to work well with the legislature. And my question really is, what do you think is the best advocacy route? Everybody wants data. They don't necessarily want to spend money to get that data. And what do you think is the best route for trying to make that clear to the legislature? Like, it does take a huge investment. I mean, the estimate now is something several $100,000s for the whole state to try to get to a place where we could get that. When you've got a lot of other challenges, that's a lot of money.
It is. It is. I think, yes, our case management system is funded through the state, through our Colorado District Attorney's Council. And it is a challenge to get additional funding. We are in a discussion right now. Actually, this conference that I'm attending is the Colorado District Attorney Council conference. And we had a board meeting yesterday and talked about whether we should move into a better system ourselves. Our system is pretty good. It's not really bad. It's a little clunky too, but it's pretty good. But as technology advances, we need to keep up, and we are going to be having discussions about, do we need to switch to a different system? I think you have to find a champion in the legislature who is really interested and committed to law enforcement and DA offices, and understands the complications of a statewide system. I mean, it's great that you have a statewide system, because most states don't, I don't think. And I think if you can find, there are legislators in our legislature that we know are friendly to, and Democrats as well as Republicans. We always think it's more Republicans, but we have a few of the Democrats who are more inclined to be supportive of DA requests and DA bills. So I think finding, a few key people who you can educate about what's going on. And if you have someone that's on the budget committee, that's of course ideal, but that's not always possible. I think emphasizing how important this is for the community and how DA's offices haven't traditionally been transparent, and we're really trying to be transparent now, and it can lead to changes in how we do business, because it can and it will. I think it's just that we're just kind of in the beginning stages, but ultimately the better data we can gather and use, it's going to inform how we can improve what we do. So I think, arguing along those lines, and even with the criminal justice reform efforts, I think you can find criminal justice reform Democrats who are willing to have this discussion, because they want transparency and they want DA's offices looking at race and ethnicity and being fair. And I think that's a way in, versus often the more progressive Democrats are not real supportive of DA bills. But I think this one is one where we can join forces. We haven't had to do that in Colorado yet, but if we do move to a new system, I think your hundreds of thousands is probably an underestimate. I think it'll be more than that for a statewide system that would track this data in a really helpful way.
Well, and what's happened here in the time we've been talking about it, of course, technology's gotten better and it's gotten more and more costly to do that. And it's not a sexy thing to spend money on. Nobody wants to say, I helped to alleviate disparities because I bought a new system. But there is that link. But what have you done in your own office in terms of your prosecutors? We talked a little bit before you came on about DAs cringe when you ask them to do that, and they wonder, like, what's that going to mean for me? Have you done an approach to your folks in terms of trainings? Are you letting them see are you distributing to them the reports that are being generated so they see how it informs where you're going? How did you get that buy-in from people in your own office?
So that's a great question, because that is, yes, people are very nervous about it and they don't necessarily see the need for it. So we started with this internal group that was bigger than the current working group, but we had an internal group of about, 15, 16 people that were from different parts of the office, and they participated in helping develop questions that would be, not questions, but coding questions that we wanted answered. What did we want to look at? And so a part of their charge was to then go out and talk to their colleagues and explain to them what we were doing, and help to get some of that buy-in, which worked relatively well. And now we have this working group. But I will say that I don't think a lot of the attorneys really look at the data dashboard very much. And so I was talking to the other elected DA who does the one who does the judges' meetings. And what she's doing, and I think we're going to start doing that, is every month when they have their monthly management meetings, they do they talk about the dashboard and some piece of the dashboard. And I think that we have, we all got so busy that, it kind of hasn't been as front and center in my office as it should be. So that's something that we're working on now, is developing a way to have more meaningful conversations with our management folks about what is this showing us and what can we do about it, and what information do you want about your attorneys that you're supervising. So I see us over the next year kind of doing more of that internal work. The first year was more sort of external work, and now I think we'll work on getting the buy-in. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are attorneys who are not particularly supportive of, especially this internal dashboard idea. But also, younger attorneys love data. I mean, they've grown up with data. They know how to use it. They're interested in it. And I think that they could learn, they'll be interested in, what is my caseload and how do I compare with other attorneys in terms of how long it takes me to dispose of a case, and am I pleading out too many cases for lower levels than other people. I think with the younger attorneys, they'll be much more receptive. They're much more receptive to this kind of information because they're they're more used to it, and they like data. Us old folks, we're like nervous about the whole thing because.
Well, you're right, and they're just so much more fluent in it that hopefully, and it's different. I mean, many people have been doing this work for a long time. We have always taken the position what comes in the door is what we address, and we don't need to be doing that digging in piece.
Right.
District Attorney, I really appreciate you joining us today. I know you're at the conference, and I truly understand how busy you are. So thank you so very much. And we'll distribute the information that we put out about yours. If you want to send us the PowerPoint, I'll send that out to the people who are with us today as well. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Thank you for looking at this.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. All right, and moving to our next speaker, we are happy today to have with us Michael Coelho, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Programs at the Probation Service here in Massachusetts. And in that role, Michael works with partners across all the court departments to implement the really innovative evidence-based practices in community supervision that have as their goal having better outcomes and reducing recidivism. He oversees the Office of Community Corrections, which we work with so closely, probation's involvement in the specialty courts, the drug testing vendors, the transitional housing programs, interstate supervision, and those new programs, which probation, I have to say, has done a really good job of putting in place those programs that have come out of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative findings. And prior to joining probation, he was at EOPS, the Executive Office of Public Safety, for 11 years. He was the Chief of Staff, as well as the Assistant Secretary of Public Policy and Planning. And Michael received his bachelor's degree from Harvard and his master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. So thank you so much. You've helped us before with this kind of topic, and we're so happy to have you. I'm always happy when people come back because sometimes they want to lose their number after we've gotten and asked them so many questions. But thank you for being here with us today.
I'm so happy to be asked back. Sometimes it doesn't happen either. Like, no, we're good with you, Mike. We had enough of you. So I appreciate always being asked back. I enjoyed our last conversation. And I think since we last met in the June of 2021. And we just begun our work with the Commission on Structural Racism in Probation. So as part of police reform initiatives that occurred after the murder of George Floyd, the legislature passed a series of reforms. Included were several commissions to examine what they called institutional or structural racism within probation, a separate one with parole, a separate one with the DOC. So we did a lot of work with that commission, chaired by the legislature, and provided some data on our practice when it came to race and ethnicity and disparity. And so what we saw was some surprisingly good information, but also some challenges that remain. And one of our key challenges, and I referenced this last time we talked, is the inability to get data in real time and easily. So the analysis I'll share with you took a lot of work. It's a sample-based analysis, right? So I have over 50,000 people on probation. I should press a button and should tell me everything I need to know about those people, what's going on with them, if they've had violations, time to violation, break it out by race, ethnicity, break it out by court, break it out by probation officer. So we can easily see operationally how we're doing and manage to that situation. Absent that sort of granular level data, that local level data, I can pull data in the aggregate. It can tell me overall what's going on, but then it makes it a little bit harder to identify the nature of the problem and how we address it more specifically. So with help of the legislature, they've given us an IT bond authorization to modernize the trial court system. I'm sure that's something your office is happy to hear. You're probably tired of faxes and typewriters. And so one of the things that we're going to be implementing is a new case management system. We've selected a vendor. We're now selecting another vendor that has a lot of experience modifying. Salesforce is the main vendor. It's the platform. but other vendors have expertise in modifying Salesforce to fit the business need of the agency that selected it. So that's currently out to bid. And what we want is to be able to produce this analysis quickly, real time, with a lot of granular level tech context to it, because this isn't homework for us, right? This isn't some, research and data isn't a homework assignment that's interesting to look at every once in a while. It needs to have operational value. And so it can help manage your workforce, help identify training needs, especially. When we see a challenge, a lot of it can be addressed through training. And so what kind of training, who needs it? That's something that's important that can come from these kind of performance analysis. And so, for example, some of the data you see here comes from 2019. It was the last year before the pandemic. The pandemic greatly sort of changed violation practice for 2 years, right? Violations are an evidentiary process. Due process is involved. And, the first two, 2021 into 2022, violations overall were way down. So we couldn't use that as a way to understand our process, because there was an artificial thing that was bringing our violations down. So we look at 2019. And since 2019, we've adopted a lot of trainings to strengthen our understanding of how to work with different, with gender, with race, and with ethnicity. And so, led by Pamerson Eiffel, Deputy Commissioner for Pretrial Services, we've done he's developed a training called Seeing Red, red being short for race and ethnic diversity. Very powerful training. It's an all-day training, talking about the history of the criminal justice system and the trial court when it comes to issues of race and ethnicity, talking about implicit bias, explicit bias, our challenges in our society and criminal justice system. It's a very powerful training. It's a mandatory training for all our staff. And, we hope when we do this analysis again, we'll see a different, some improved results. But the results we see here, like I said, have some surprising good news, but also identify some challenges. So I'm going to show you just a snippet of it. The deck is like 40-something slides. So I'm not going to go through all that in 20 minutes. And I want to do that to your team here and your participants. And so I'm going to just show you a couple things. I'll talk quickly about the methodology. And then what we're going to look at is violation practice. So technical violations, which are filed at the discretion of probation officer, right? A new offense is an automatic violation, and there's less discretion. So what we have here is analysis of our discretion. How do we decide to file technical violation, and who gets the technical violation filed? But then as our previous participant panel, Ms. McGann indicated, a lot of times data just has us ask more questions, right? The data in itself doesn't tell us the whole story. You have to dig deeper to find, some of what's going on. So what I'm going to share with you is just some analysis that we shared with the Commission on Structural Racism regarding our violation practice. So let's see if I can bring this up. Can folks see that? Methodology, analysis of outcomes? That screen showing?
Yes.
Yes.
Great.
You
So,
want to maybe do you want to hit slideshow? I think
that's right. Yeah, it's a little bit
make
bigger.
it bigger. Yeah, just make it a little bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So I'll start with this. Let me just move that. So this tells you the demographics in our caseload, right? And so what we want to see here is, in general, what we saw in 2021 is basically about 18% identified as Black and African American. We use federal census designation still, which is, in itself a challenge. And then if you scroll down a little bit, you can see ethnicity, Latino, almost a similar percentage, about 17.7%. Now, if you were to look at this, includes all case types, so administrative, some pretrial probation, risk need cases. If you were to break it out by, say, district and superior, you might see a different disparity in terms of overall participation in the caseload. But in general, this is what we're seeing. So that's sort of our baseline. And so, the representation in the probation and criminal justice caseload. The big data point I want to flag for you, you can see it here, is not known, not reported. 13%. And so that's a problem when you have that data, that much data missing. And so since this, we've seen, we've done more recent data pulls that show the not known, not reported shrinking. So doing a better job of capturing that information, and that's important, right? You have to have good data to start with. To have that many sort of folks not known, not reported can be limiting. And so we're seeing now ratios of missing data down around 5%, 6%, as opposed to 13%. So in this, this is the methodology to give you a sense. We looked at violations that occurred in calendar year 2019. It's a sample base, right? So it's not every single violation. It's a sample of violations that are representative of the case departments, the court departments, and the case types that we have in probation. We did that because calendar year 20 and 2021 were impacted by COVID. Much fewer violations were issued. And so this sample has, 20,000 technical criminal violations filed by a probation officer, just ones that had a code associated with it. And so these are cases where probation employees assign a specific code to the free text entries indicating violation procedure has occurred. The sample size is large enough, consists of enough different courts to provide a valid representation. Sample consists of people sentenced to probation, so does not include conditions of release Part B or Part A, but does have people sentenced to pretrial probation. And we use something called a risk analysis and what's called a relative rate index to try to understand disproportionality. So when a probation officer files a technical violation, non-compliance with a condition, are we disproportionately filing them against different communities of color? That's our goal here. And our methodology is consistent with national methodology used by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to understand disproportionate impact on minority populations. So this is our risk rate. This is the preliminary data that tells us what's the risk of someone in a particular group getting what's called a probation finding. You see a large group in Hispanic and Native American and Native Hawaiian. Native Hawaiian and American Indian are sort of have a caveat because the sample size is so small. There's only about 30 or so cases that indicate that. So the sample size is difficult to determine. Is there real disparity because the sample size is so small? And so what we're finding here, right, is disproportionality. Is there a violation found? And so the line that you see going down would be 1, right? So 1 tells us there's no disproportionality, that it's about equal to what their percentage is in the caseload. Above 1 tells us the disproportionality, it's more often occurring that they're having a violation found. And then below 1 means it's occurring a little bit less. And so here you're actually seeing a violation of probation finding occurring a little bit less in the African American population. Now, the difference between 0.92 and 1, I think you could say, is within the margin of error. And so we can't make a definitive conclusion, but you're not seeing the opposite, meaning on the other side of 1, above 1, a huge disparity. You are seeing, obviously, with Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, disparity of a violation being found compared to the probation, their representation in the caseload. But again, the sample size is so small, it's hard to determine if that's just noise in the data because of the small sample size. The greater the sample size, the more validity the data has. But for the Hispanic and Latino population, you are seeing a small disparity on the violation, disproportionality of the violation found. And so if it was, again, 1.10, I could say that's noise in the data, but it's a little bit higher than that. And so it's something we need to keep an eye on and keep track of and ask more questions about what's occurring here with the Latino population in terms of violations being found. And so that's part of the reason we're doing the trainings that we're doing, is to help sort of address this head on. So as noted in that chart, Black and African American probation violation notices are resulting in a violation found at a slightly lower rate than their white counterparts. In contrast, you're seeing disproportionality for the Latino and Hispanic population. The next slide that I'm going to show you it demonstrates another probation outcome, right? So a violation of probation has been found, has probation been modified or continued, right? So, that would be a good thing, right? If probation is modified or continued, they're staying under supervision. And so we consider that a good outcome, that someone stays on probation with either no changes or a small change in their conditions. Again, the value of 1, that line that comes down, remains the same. Someone's over the line, they're overrepresented compared to the white counterparts. If they're under the line, they're underrepresented. In this instance, the fact that they're below the line means they're underrepresented and outcome is deemed favorable compared to their white counterparts. So here, in terms of the probation continued or modified, what we're seeing is that, again, I think we see this as somewhat good news, in that there's not really a lot of difference compared to the white population when it comes to finding probation modified or probation being continued. African Americans at 0.90, you would say they're underrepresented in what's a good outcome, but it's right on that margin, right, that 10% margin. And so it could just be noise in the data. I'd be more concerned if it was, 0.8 or 0.7. That means they're being underrepresented compared to the white counterparts in a good outcome. Hispanic, again, is about the same as white. That 0.3 is not statistically significant difference than their white counterparts. So this tells us some good news when it comes to treatment of folks upon probation continued or modified. So as noted on the previous slide, there is a slight difference in Black and African American probationers having their probation modified continued at slightly lower rates than white counterparts. Other populations are about the same or slightly higher. Now, in this next slide, I'm going to show you, and this will be the last one that I'll show you, and then we can sort of have a discussion or have questions. Has probation been terminated or revoked? Right, so which is a negative consequence of the violation. And so the value of 1 remains the same. If a group is over the line, they're overrepresented compared to the white counterparts. If they're under the line, then they're underrepresented. In this case, the outcome is considered a negative 1. So over the line means the group is overrepresented, outcome deemed unfavorable. And so in this one, again, we are seeing some promising data that when it comes to the Black and African American population, the disproportionality is about the same as white when it comes to, obviously, the rate of having their probation terminated or revoked is about the same as their white counterparts. The Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, again, you're seeing a huge disparity, right? 1.55 compared to the white counterparts. Again, the sample size is so small, we want to show it, but because the sample size is so small, 1 or 2 violations dramatically changes that percentage. But Latino Hispanic, you're seeing some real disparity there. Not, again, compared nationally, you're not seeing at the rate nationally some of the disparity, but certainly something we want to keep track of here in Massachusetts and make sure it's something we're trying to address through training. 1.35 is showing a disproportionate number of Latinos compared to the white counterparts having probation terminated or revoked. So again, they're showing clear disproportional impact for the Latino population compared to the white counterparts. The Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander sample is very small, only 15 cases, which impacts this analysis. And with Black and African American individuals, you're seeing it being very close to being equally represented in the violation outcome as their white counterparts. So this potentially could result the result of natural variation in the data. So that just gives you some of the work that we've done with the Commission on Structural Racism. That was a public process with public hearings. We shared this information publicly at the time. I'm sure it's on a legislative page. If you want to access it, I'll forward it to Alice, DA Ryan, Casey, if that'd be helpful. But we're doing this analysis across the board. So when I look at drug court participation, we can see that African American, Latino, Latinx population underrepresented. in the number of people in drug court. So they're participating at rates of 8 to 9% when their overall participation in the caseload is much higher. So we know we have a challenge in attracting that population because drug court's voluntary. You have to agree to it. We do find in that analysis that they're treated the same. And so in terms of graduation rates, termination rates, they're the same. So that's good data we have to share as part of communicating the value that if you're in, you're treated the same as anyone else. The system's not rigged, right? We have to build trust. And that's a challenge. If you're asking someone to do something voluntarily with us, we need to address our history and the unfairness and try to build trust. And so it's one of the reasons we changed the name of our centers to the Community Justice Support Centers, as opposed to Community Corrections, to show our sort of treatment-oriented focus. We have to engage with the community. When we see data, we just can't take it at face value. So when we saw that data, we work now with the UMass medical folks, UMass Chan, to do a more in-depth study with communities of color as to why they don't participate in drug courts. You hear, through interviews, why people are suspicious of drug court and why they don't want to participate. So that's the kind of follow-through you need when you see these data points. We can't make assumptions on how to fix it. You got to do that deeper dive, which you've talked about already, DA Ryan and the previous panelists, is a lot of times you just got to, it's not enough, right? You got to do more work. The data makes you want to ask more questions. And that's part of the work is to do that. So we track usage of resources like housing, usage of resources like the Behavioral Health Initiative for Justice Involved, to make sure that it's representative of our caseload and that everyone's accessing equally. So when we do these videos with UMass on the Behavioral Health Initiative for Justice Involved, we feature participants who are from communities of color to help build trust, right? We've earned that mistrust over many, many decades and centuries, and it's going to take a lot of work to earn it back. And so you just got to do that work. It's hard work, but you have to try to rebuild trust and show that we're committed to equity, we're committed to fair treatment, we're committed to restoring people what they've lost because of incarceration or their involvement in the justice system through housing support and healthcare support. That's just the work we have to do. It's hard work. We're all trying to do it, but that's our job. So I'll end there, and there's about 10 minutes for questions.
Have you looked at, excuse me, have you looked at the impact, besides a lack of trust, the impact on some of the more pragmatic things? Like for us in Middlesex, one of the issues I always have is how much is it that people don't participate in things because, for instance, lack of public transportation?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. So, what we look at in probation is called a hierarchy of needs. So how can I get someone to do something if they can't get to the place, if they're worried about their housing, if they can't address their health care, right? Like before I get them to focus on, cognitive behavioral therapy to change their antisocial thinking, you have to address those needs first. And that's because they've lost a lot of those things due to incarceration. And so, for example, the Justice Support Centers, we have we have remote programming. We have online programming. We do about 300 to 400 hours a week remotely to help address transportation issues. We found during the pandemic, so for example, before the pandemic, someone would not go to the Justice Support Center for class that day, right? They wouldn't go to the counseling session. They wouldn't go to the employment or education class. If they were struggling, they just skipped the day. What we found during the pandemic with remote programming is they'd still turn the camera on, right? They would still participate in remote programming, and we could see that they were struggling with a health issue or maybe they had relapsed. And we would send, a wellness check or an ambulance to their house. We did that several times. And so again, that's that new generation, I think, that your previous panelists discussed, a comfort with technology and more comfort with sharing their life on the screen. So they wouldn't necessarily go that day, but they would turn the camera on. And so that's one way to address challenges, both as they have personal struggles, if they can't make it that day because of the transportation challenge. The BHGI initiative in Project North, which is a federal grant that we have, provide transportation support to get to treatment. You know, we're struggling now with trying to replace some federal funding that's about to expire for transportation support that we have in the south of Boston. And so it's definitely something that we're cognizant of, those challenges, lack of equitable access. And so I can't talk to someone about their probation conditions, about getting their high set, getting their job if they can't have housing. So we do sober housing placements, something we co-manage with parole. We have the transitional housing. We have 2 in Boston, 1 in New Bedford, 1 in Weston Springfield. We're actually looking to open up 1 in Middlesex this fall. Transitional housing support in Middlesex. We're sort of working out the details there. A 25-bed transitional support house. And so we're providing anywhere from 2 to 8 months of housing support across those 3 platforms. I can tell you for the month of July, we support about 500 people across the state with housing, transitional housing, temporary housing. It's a tough market. But if we're trying to get them to do the other things, you got to address those basic needs first. You're absolutely right. And when you see the data on the housing use, you're going to see a much different demographic. So when we look at the housing use, it was majority minority, meaning over 50% were from African American and Latinx communities. White was a minority. So absolutely, we have to address the hierarchy of needs if we're going to get anyone to start doing the other work that we need to do to do behavior change.
Are there pieces of information that you think DA's offices could be better about getting from probation? And, you know, do you have some recommendations on how do we improve that partnership? I sometimes think that you have things that we don't know. Maybe we have things that you need. Like, how could we make that better?
Yeah, I think it's like forums like this, local presentations as well. You know, we have a whole department of pretrial services, and so that's tracking, you know, their outcome. So, for example, one of the things we're doing in probation, led by, you know, Deputy Commissioner Pamerson Eiffel, is we're having our justice support centers become what's called community application counselors for mass health. So people can get their mass health either started or renewed if it's been suspended. And so you probably want to have awareness of that. So you put someone in pretrial conditions of release B with drug testing and evaluation as a condition. You want to be aware of the resources, but then you want to know, is it working? Hey, Mike, hey, Pamerson, how many people went through and got mass health through you? Hey, how many people in general, when they're on pretrial conditions of release B, how are they doing if they're on the behavioral health initiative? You know, what are those outcomes? So you can see the performance of the vendors we work with, and you can see if it's helping the person that you're working with, or is it not helping? You know, and you have to escalate the intervention. So I think it just requires, you know, like anything else, just making the time. You know, we all get sort of caught in our world, but I find when we talk to each other more frequently, we give each other better ideas, better insight, better analysis. And so I think we have a lot that we can share about pretrial, especially, you know, both sides, sentence to probation, but especially on pretrial. I know that's a big part, you know, of caseloads and of a lot of concern, right? Because you're doing the best to try to keep someone in the community and get them access treatment in the community. You're trying to avoid that bail or incarceration in the jail. Are we doing the right thing? I'm sure you've seen, in general, anecdotally, because of the pandemic, people on pretrial for an extended period of time. And maybe they're on a bracelet or not, but they did okay, right? It seemed like it worked. Well, you want to see data in general from Middlesex County. How many people that we put on a condition of release in 2021 had no other intervening events? You know, and having that data might be helpful to see.
One question I always have is, you know, we might be thinking of putting somebody either on probation, either pretrial or post-conviction. And it's clear that he or she needs these kinds of services. In a perfect world, defense counsel comes to us and says, my client's been accepted at this place, and this place. And then we can try to figure that out. Okay, that looks good. Those are conditions. what happens when that piece hasn't happened? You know, maybe there hasn't been good enough collaboration. They haven't been able to get the client into a place. Like how does a DA, especially a younger DA, figure out, I know this defendant needs whatever. Where is it? I don't just want to say, go get that. I want to say, go to this place. What's the best way for them to really structure that?
So yeah, there's a lot of resources pre-trial. So one of the things, I know you worked on this yourself in criminal justice reform, is to expand access to the justice support centers for both pretrial services and pretrial treatment.
Right.
And so that's something we want to make sure you have aware of, and as well as defense bar. And one of the things that we testified on recently before the Judiciary Committee is one, making our name change more official, reflecting our focus on treatment, but two, also allowing for pretrial assessments that the center may do to stay private, right? So people don't trust because the assessment may be discoverable in a pretrial phase. Other states have that wall, so they can do an assessment and we can point them in all the right directions. Hey, this person needs these things, and not necessarily have it be prejudicial to their case. So we've asked for that change in the statute. Rep. Kate Lipper-Garabedian filed that bill for us, and we testified on it a few weeks ago. But it's certainly, I can show you all the resources. Like for Middlesex County, our BHGI vendors advocates, which I'm sure a lot of you folks are familiar with. It's a big provider in Middlesex. They offer pretrial assistance. We have centers in Woburn and in Lowell and Framingham. What's there? What are some of the other treatment providers that we use? What are the sober houses that are accepting people in Middlesex County as part of the sober house placement program? So I think it's, I can send links to some of these resources.
Great.
It may be helpful just to do like an hour with your team, or if you have a training of new DAs, or however you want to do it. We're having some events at the Social Law Library to talk about some of these things. But if we want something more focused and dedicated to your team, we're more than willing to come out and share these resources. There is a lot more out there. One of the great things about justice reform is that it gave us a shared resource, and we have to work with Mass Health. We have to work with housing. We have to work with parole and DOC. So we're talking a lot more to each other. And that's on our side. But those conversations should include you and the defense bar. So I'm talking to parole every other week on the housing stuff. A bunch of agencies statewide get together on BHJI every other month. There's about 80 different agencies that get on the phone to talk to each other. So these are good conversations and very productive, and we just need to extend it, to the county level and get you included.
Thank you. Michael, you've been so generous with your time. I think everything that came in the chat, any last questions that people might have? All right. Mike, again, thank you. We're going to pump everything out to people so they'll have
I'll get
it.
that to Alice. Yeah, I'll get those listings. Sure.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, DA. Thanks for the time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.
And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you found this conversation helpful. We're going to be putting out to everyone background information, links, articles. Please feel free to use us as a resource. As we told you the last time we did this, it's our plan to keep this conversation going. And we are happy to do anything in this realm that people would find helpful. So thank you all so much. Thank you to all of the folks in my office, Alice and Megan and Madeline, who helped to make this possible. And again, an enormous thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you. Be well.